Good afternoon, Roger. This is Gabriel.
Hi,
Do you
Gabriel.
hear? Do you hear as well?
Very well. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yeah, I hear it perfectly. Okay, I'm gonna introduce Professor Roger Crisp. Professor Roger Crisp. He is a professor at the University of Oxford. Uh, he worked with many different themes around ethics for many years. Very prolific author, very important author. We're gonna have the pleasure to see him talking right now. Without further ado, Professor Roger Crisp, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Can you remind me how long we have? Should I speak for maybe 25 minutes, something like that?
No, you can have 40 minutes and then 20 minutes for discussion.
Okay, let's see how it goes.
Perfect.
And can you see my slides?
Yes, pretty well.
Okay. So my title of my talk is Reductionism and What Matters in Survival. And those of you familiar with the work of Derek Parfit will have guessed that this talk is rather influenced by some of Derek Parfit's work, but I think it makes sense independently of what Derek said about the nature of personhood and the connection between the mind and the brain and so on. Because
Professor. Yeah, we can't see the screen in full screen. So maybe if you click on if you press F5, we'll do it.
can you just see all the little screens?
Yeah, just the little screens. If
Uh,
you press F5, I think that will be solved.
let's have a look. F5 isn't doing anything.
Is it doing it? Okay. So like beside comments below, down below, you see notes, comments. Um, on the fourth icon, I think it's the fourth icon. You can click there, and you'll get the full screen.
Uh, I see. Are you saying to the right of
Yeah,
comments?
to the right. To the,
1, 2, 3, 4.
I think that's the one.
Ah, did that
There we
work?
go. Yes, it did work. Great.
So I'll have to go back a bit. Can you now see the whole slide?
Yes, perfectly.
Brilliant, thank you. So
Okay.
you've talked something about Zoom. I'm grateful for that. Yeah, so as I say, I think it should make sense, independently of knowledge of Parfit, because Parfit is working in the tradition that he calls reductionism. Some people call it Humeanism. In the latest Phil survey online, it's referred to, I think, as the psychological theory of personhood. And the Phil survey suggests that it is now the most common view by some margin among analytic philosophers, anyway. In other words, there are rather few philosophers around now who believe that what makes us the same person through time is our having the same soul, for example, or having some kind of Cartesian ego that is the same from birth to death. Rather, people believe that we understand persons across time by thinking of them as series of connected experiences. So that's why Parfit calls it reductionism, because he said he's sort of thinking that we're reducing that idea of the self to these experiences, and there's no ego, no Cartesian ego in the picture. And those of you who do know Parfit will know that he's sort of quite famous for claiming that identity is not what matters when it comes to deciding whether somebody is the same person over time. Rather, it's a matter of survival. And that is partly because of certain cases that he discusses, certain sort of imaginary cases. And I'm going to begin with one of the most famous ones, which will illustrate why he says that about identity. And this is a case that he calls my division. So according to this case, my body is fatally injured, as are the brains of my two brothers. My brain is divided, and each half is successfully transplanted into the body of one of my brothers. Each of the resulting people believes that he is me, seems to remember living my life, has my character, and is in every other way psychologically continuous with me. And he has a body that is very like mine. So the question is, how should we think about that from the point of view of the person whose body has been fatally injured? And, you know, Parfit first of all considered a case in which my brain, the whole of my brain, is transplanted into the body of one brother. And he says, I think quite rightly, that most people would say, oh, right, well, you know, I've survived in somebody else's body. But he thinks it's difficult for me to say that in the case of my division, because it now looks as if there are two people around. And it would be rather arbitrary to say that, you know, the individual before is identical with either one of them. So he wants to say that you know, that person is not identical with either of them. And we should just stop talking about identity. We should just talk about the connected experiences in each case. Now, I think that sort of makes sense, though what I will be suggesting is that Parfit probably moved too far away from the Humean tradition and failed to recognize that what matters, according to Hume, is identity. If you're thinking about some future person from the perspective of your own interest, because that person's interests should matter a lot to you now if that person is in the same series of experiences that you're in. So we do want some identity conditions, but the identity conditions are those of a series. But that still raises the question how we should respond to my division. And what Parfit says is that my division is twice as good as ordinary survival. So in the case where, as it were, the brain is put into the body of one brother, that's pretty good because the life continues. In the case of my division, it's twice as good because there are two lives being lived. And essentially what he's saying is that surviving ordinarily for 60 years and division into two people who each survive 30 years is they're equivalent in value. And that seems to be a natural and plausible view, because for a reductionist anyway, in that it's division is preserving twice as much of what's good or valuable, what I should care about. Now, of course, mere survival doesn't matter at all, and Parfit's quite clear about that. What matters is surviving and having a life that has some kind of value in it, and in particular has in mind well-being, what makes a person's life go well or badly for them. And that raises some questions which I'm going to address in my talk. And here they are. So Parfit talks about our relatedness rather than identity. And the relation is this relation between experiences. So, you know, if I have a memory of having some experience, say I have this memory at t, and the experience that I'm remembering happened at t-1, then we have an R relation there between the memory and the experience of the memory. And that's part of what supports our talking about a person over time. That's the kind of series that he's thinking of. But because connectedness and continuity of experiences can vary, how should we understand what matters when it comes to decreasing connectedness and continuity? And it's tempting to think that what matters here is proportional to our relatedness. So if we take some value, V, let's say, and V is going to occur in the life of an individual who's are related to me, but only, as it were, half as much as I'm are related to myself a few seconds from now, then that'll be of only half the value to me. So this is what you might call the proportional view of how our relatedness connects with value, and I'll say a bit more about that later. The second question is to do with for whom well-being in a case like division is good, because well-being is what, you know, it's just another term for what's good for the individual. So that well-being that occurs after the split in my division, for whom is it good? Usually we'll be able to say, well, well-being accrues to the person, because splits like this don't tend to happen. But in the case of my division, we do have a split. And if we want to go on talking about the person before the split and then the people who emerge from the division or the split, we've got three people there in play. So if we're going to understand well-being there, I'm going to suggest we need a new term, and that's going to that term I'm going to stipulate is one of ownership. So that's the second thing I'm going to talk about. Now, initially, the talk's going to focus particularly on pleasure and pain. So we'd first understand what reductionists who are hedonists about well-being will say about what matters in survival. But there are, of course, other accounts of well-being, in particular desire, fulfillment accounts, and objective list accounts. And in the final section of the talk, I'll briefly bring out the implications for what matters in survival for those who accept these non-hedonist theories. Okay, so let's go back to the first question, and I'll say a little bit more about what Parfit means by psychological connectedness and continuity. I've mentioned continuity of memories. He also talks about connections between an intention to act in a particular way and that particular action, and the continuing existence of beliefs, desires, and any other psychological features. So if your future is going to be valuable, there has to be some psychological connectedness or continuity for you to be there, as it were, to benefit from the value. But as I said, it also matters that there's some value in the life in question. And these two considerations, connectedness and value, can come into some tension with one another. So, for example, when he's discussing cases of fusion, which are a bit like my division with the, as it were, the Y turned upside down, where two individuals get sort of squished together. He says this. He says this is about a possible case of fusion. The value to me of my relation to a resulting person depends both, one, on my degree of connectedness to this person, and two, on the value, in my view, of this person's physical and psychological features. Suppose that hypnosis causes me to lose 5 unwanted features: my untidiness, laziness, fear of flying, nicotine addiction, and all my memories of my wretched life. There is here much less than full psychological connectedness, but this is more than outweighed by the removal of bad features. Okay, so the thought path it seems to be having there is, well, I'm kind of less connected than I was to my previous self, and that given that this life that I now have is valuable, that's a bit of a pity, because if I were more connected, that would be better. But I've also, through losing the connection, I've lost some of these bad features, and that may overall be better. So this raises the question how we should understand the role of degree of connectedness in relation to value. And as I said before, I think what's going on in this passage, and what's going on in Parfit generally, and in the thinking of reductionists generally, is that what matters in survival is straightforwardly proportional to degree of connectedness, right? So that was my example of the case where you're 50% connected to an individual who has some value V in their life in future. That the value of that is V over 2 to you now. And if somebody said to you, well, I can arrange it so that you actually have 2 of those pleasures at that point in your future life, that's equivalent to being fully connected to that person and just having the single pleasure. So this, I think, we can call the proportional view of the relationship between psychological connectedness and value. And it does seem a very natural view, I think. I've heard it expressed by quite a few people. But what I want to suggest now is that it's wrong. It's not correct. In fact, it's really wrong. It's missed something quite significant. And to illustrate that, I want to give you an example, which some of you may have come across. This is the proportionality view, stated value times proportional connectedness equals how much survival matters. And this is the example which Parfit calls Williams's example, because it comes from Bernard Williams. And I'm not going to read it all out, but I'll summarize it. Interestingly, in the first edition of Reasons and Persons, Parfit gave this example some other name. I can't remember now what it was, but I presume that Williams said to him, hey, that's my example. So he changed the name in future editions. So what happens in this example is that you have to imagine that some crazy neurosurgeon kidnaps you and takes you to their laboratory where they do terrible things to people, and the neurosurgeon says, look, first of all, I'm going to give you amnesia, so you'll just lose all your memories, and you'll have complete amnesia. And let's say you'd lose lots of specific beliefs and so on as well. And then the surgeon says, once I've done that, once I've sort of cleared your brain in that way, I'm going to make you believe that you're Napoleon. And I'm going to put in fake memories, quasi memories of Napoleon's life into your brain. And finally, the surgeon says, look, when I've done that, I'm going to change your character so that it's like Napoleon's. And what you have to note is that all this is, as it were, purely dispositional, because while the torture is happening, you won't, whoever that person is who's having those horrible experiences won't be thinking about, their memories of 1812 or anything like that. They'll just be thinking about the pain. Now, Williams intended his case as a counterexample to the psychological criterion of identity, and Parfit's also ready to accept there's no psychological continuity between me now, or you now, if you're imagining it's you, and the person after all the switches have been flipped. But as I said before, identity does matter in reductionism, because we need to be able to talk about the same series of temporally extended experiences, and we have to be able to identify experiences as members of the same series. And I think, despite what Williams and Parfit seem to think about this, it's highly plausible that in the Williams example, the subject of that series of experiences is the same throughout. That's why we find it so terrifying when we're thinking about it. In other words, we can distinguish a stream of experience by distinguishing the subject, and that subject is the same one throughout the series, even though along with it goes some very major psychological changes. But that's Williams's example, and I think there's some lessons there for the reductionist. One is that if you're going to talk about connectedness and continuity, you really should accept that streams of consciousness are a form of continuity. But I also think that what the example shows is that what matters for us in survival is not just the proportion of overlap between our current experiences and future experiences. So the value-based view is wrong, because actually what matters is that you're in the same, the future person is in the same series. It doesn't really matter what connection, what degree of connection there is there. That pain that the neurosurgeon is going to inflict on you is not made any easier to bear by your losing various irrelevant memories about your childhood or something like that. I mean, that's got nothing to do with it. It's happening to you because you are essentially identical with that series of experiences. So that's the value-based view of what matters in survival. What matters is the survival in the series that constitutes me, of those elements of my psychology that underpin or constitute well-being. So that was the first question I wanted to answer in the talk, about how connectedness and value relate to one another. And I've argued for the value-based view. But now we go on to the second question, which is, what do we say about the as it were, the well-being that accrues to those two people that emerge in the case of my division? For whom is that well-being good? Well, if Parfit is to say that my division is twice as good as ordinary survival for me, then it must be the case that in some sense I'm identical with both of the people that emerge after the division. And I think what we should say then is that the well-being in that case accrues to the set of those three people. The well-being is owned by the set. That's the language that I would want to use. Now, this has a peculiar implication, of course, because we're saying that, and Parfit should really agree, given what he says about my division, we're saying that this well-being, in this case, has a single owner. And that means that well-being can accrue to a single owner through two experiences happening to two spatially separate subjects of experience contemporaneously. Okay, because the two people that emerge from my division, they're going to go off and live their own lives in different places. But we want to talk about there being a single owner of well-being. And that may seem odd, but I think as a reductionist could suggest that it's no more odd really than allowing well-being to accrue to a single owner through experiences at different times. And in the book, Parfit describes a case which he calls my physics exam, in which a person can divide their mind into two separate streams of consciousness. A physics exam. So the idea is you're taking a physics exam. You've got two questions to complete. You realize that it's going to take you too long to do both of them before the exam stops, but you have this ability to divide your mind. And you can sort of divide your consciousness and work on one question with one part of your consciousness, and then with the other part of your consciousness, you can work on the other question. And Parfit says, I believe that a person's mental history need not be like a canal with only one channel, but could be like a river, occasionally having separate streams. My description of my experiences in my physics exam seems both to be coherent and to describe something we can imagine. So what I'm suggesting is that my division is a bit like my physics exam, except it's not really a canal. It's not a river which is having separate streams which then come and join up. It's more like the delta of a river where the river splits and the two parts never meet up, but they're the same river. And it seems to me reductionists ought to be happy about that. Now, it's true that this wouldn't really fit very well with the current emotions and attitudes that we have. So if one of the individuals, one of the people after the division were to hear that the other one was being tortured, they'd be sorry for them, but they'd be pleased it wasn't them. That's the way people would feel. But the reductionist could say, look, that's just our emotions, and they're bound up with the mistaken Cartesian view of identity. And it could be that our emotions really ought to change if they're going to be rational. So, and we should start feeling about these other people in the same way that we might feel about ourselves. So, for example, consider the common elements in the emotions you would feel knowing you were about to be tortured in an hour, and those you'd feel knowing that your child was about to be tortured. Okay. So that just to summarize that discussion, on the Cartesian view, in my division, I die. I come to an end and two new individuals come into being. The reductionist view I was arguing says there's a single owner of well-being. We have the physics exam where Parfit talks about a river which has separate streams occasionally, but then joins up again. And I'm suggesting that we should think of my division as like a river, but it's like the delta of a river. So the two parts never meet up again, but it's the same river. It doesn't seem to matter too much whether they come together again or not. And then I suggested that maybe our emotions could adapt to this these cases in which I, as an owner of well-being, I'm in two places at the same time. So that was the second question I was going to address. For whom is my division good? And finally, I just want briefly to say a little bit about non-hedonist theories of well-being. And I think the case we discussed, Williams's case, it tells us really what a hedonist is going to say, that what matters for you is the continued existence of your capacity for hedonic experience. That's all that matters. And as long as that's, as long as that future capacity is the capacity you now have, what that capacity experiences is relevant to you now, because that's the series of experience you should be identifying yourself with, and you should care about what experiences that hedonic capacity has. You shouldn't really care too much about what memories you have in that future time, or beliefs or character traits or anything like that, except insofar as they affect your hedonic experience. That would be the hedonist view. But what about the non-hedonist views, desire theories and so-called objective bliss theories? Well, desires are interesting because hedonism is forward-looking. It says what matters to you is just the now, is just the pleasure and pain you experience in the future. Whereas a desire theorist might say, no, it's not just the future that matters. We also want to know whether you had certain desires in the past which are going to be fulfilled in the future. And that's going to raise questions about whether those desires, as it were, still have to exist when they're fulfilled. So there's kind of diachronic aspect to the issue there coming in through the desire theory. So, for example, imagine that for a long time I desire to write a successful novel. If I've already written the novel, my survival, in a sense, doesn't matter. What matters is that the novel is successful. But it looks like there should be posthumous goods on desire theory. But in the case of certain other desires, my survival does matter because I have to be around for the desire to be fulfilled. And these would be, for example, what what Williams calls I desires. So imagine that this is not the example on the slide there, but imagine that you have a very strong desire to visit the Louvre to see Vermeer's painting, the Lace Maker. Well, what matters when it comes to the significance of your seeing the Lace Maker and its connection with your well-being? Well, it doesn't matter that you have psychological connectedness to any particular degree between having the desire and when you see the painting. We've already seen in the case of William's example that psychological connectedness of that kind. And it'd be sort of weird, I think, if early in your life you formed, you heard about this painting and maybe you saw some pictures of it and you formed this very strong desire to see it, and you thought, oh, well, I must really get over there to Paris to see it as soon as possible to maximize the psychological connectedness between me and the individual that sees the painting. What matters is that you have the desire and then you see the painting, even if it's towards the end of your life. That's going to satisfy your desire just as effectively. But what I want to suggest now is that desire theorists can deal with cases of division in the same way as the hedonists. So here's the example, and I've got one example for the desire theory and one for the objectivist theory. So here's the desire theory one. I have a strong desire to see Vermeer's lace maker and to touch the column of St. James. That's in Santiago. But I'm terminally ill and have time to fulfill only one of these desires. Then my body is fatally injured, as are the brains of my two brothers. My brain is divided and each half is successfully transplanted into the body of one of my brothers. Each of the resulting people is told that each of them has only the same amount of time left as the person before the operation. One of them visits the Louvre, the other Santiago. So there we've got the same oddity as in the original case of my division. My desire to see the Vermeer is fulfilled at the same time as my desire to touch the pillar. And what I'm understanding myself there to be is an owner of well-being. And it does seem odd. I've already said that it does seem odd when we're thinking about pleasure and pain, to realize that it can accrue to the same owner when there are two people experiencing pleasure and pain in separate places. But once we understand the facts in a reductionist way and realize that it's up to us whom we describe as a person, we can decide who's most plausibly to be described as an owner of well-being. In fact, we might even talk about the owner of well-being as a person. And that's very Parfitian. I mean, Parfit says, he echoes Wittgenstein actually, and says it's up to us how we use the word person. Okay, and then finally, just to point out that the same thing with so-called objectivist theorists. So, a very common good on objectivist theories lists is accomplishment. So in this further iteration of the my division case, I'm devoting the end of my life to writing what I hope will be a great novel, and I've made various preliminary plans for it. I know it'll take me 4 years of highly focused work to complete. I then contract a serious brain disease, which will soon affect those parts of my brain involved in writing and lead to my death after just a year. A neurosurgeon tells me that using some recently developed techniques, she can take 4/5 of my brain, divide it, and transfer each part into the body of a person physically very similar to me whose brain has been damaged beyond repair. Each of these 4 parts will replicate the functions of my current brain. The 5th I'm left with, though it will enable me to continue with most of my current activities, it will not support the kind of creativity and imagination necessary for writing. And I, like each of my successors, will die shortly after a year. I agree to the operation. The 4 successors, with reference to my earlier plans, work closely as a team, each focusing respectively on the plot, characterization, setting, and humour of the novel in the light of my plans. I just receive reports on how things are going. The novel is awarded the Booker Prize, and I'm invited to the ceremony, along with the other 4 people. Okay, so who is the owner of well-being there? Well, it's the set consisting in the pre and post division individual and the 4 descendants, as it were. And the accomplishment accrues to that single owner, but at the ceremony there will be 5 different individual mites, all streams of the same river, as Parfit mites put it. And this again shows that reductionism has radical implications for the rationality of our emotions, because if you actually you sort of imagine yourself in the position of that individual, the 5th one, at the ceremony, I think it's pretty obvious that you'd feel some sort of regret that things had turned out as they have done, because you'll see these other 4 people being congratulated and you'll think, oh, that's my novel. But that, I think, shows that if reductionism is correct, then our emotions are out of line, and we would need to adapt them to this idea of ownership. And I think the same sorts of a story can be told about other elements, objective elements in well-being, such as friendship. You know, that if you're friends with somebody and they split, you know you're friends with somebody because they have 3 attractive characteristics, and then they split, then the friendship continues, but you're now friends with a set. And I think the same would be true of knowledge and of virtue. So just to sum up, I think reductionism, when we consider it in the light of the My Division case, and we remember that according to reductionists, we're identical with series, and what matters is not just the fact that our series continues, but which elements of it continue, and in particular the elements that underpin well-being, then we'll see that reductionism has some very radical implications for our understanding of well-being, which may be a problem for reductionism. But I wasn't suggesting that it should be. It may be that reductionism is correct and that we do have to revise these views about well-being and the rationality of our emotions. So thank you very much for listening. I can, yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk. It was really, really great. So we have a question here from the audience.
Hello, thank you for your talk. And it's not really a question, it's more of a comment, as I am not a philosopher myself. But regarding the first part of your talk, when you talked about the relation between identity and how connected we feel with certain parts of who we are, I was thinking, and also when you brought up the Williams example, when you're like kidnapped by a mad neuroscientist, I was thinking about certain aspects of day-to-day life that we may have in a small way. This feeling, for example, when someone has developed suddenly, quote unquote, suddenly, a disorder such as depression, for example, or after a birth of a child, like a big event, people often afterwards say some things like, "Oh, I feel really disconnected from myself," and it seems like this disconnected sense of disconnecting, of not being close to their experience that they had before, like it really affects their identity, and they feel like they have lost these identities. And it seems to me like they usually need a few years to gather a new baggage as this new person, and have this amount of connectedness again before they can have this sense of identity before again, I guess. So it's more of a comment, I guess. But thank you.
Yeah, that is a very interesting and perceptive question. And I quite agree with you that these views do have implications for those sorts of cases where people's personalities change, possibly quite suddenly, or in the case of dementia, for example, gradually. So, you know, it's quite common for people to say, well, my mother is not the same person that she was. And they might literally mean that, but what they probably mean is, no, she is the same person. She's just very different, but she is the same person. And that's quite consistent with reductionism, because the experiences that she has post dementia are sufficiently connected to the experiences before dementia that we say that they're in the same series, it's the same stream of experiences. Now, in very, very serious cases of dementia, there's, as it were, nothing left. Apparently, it seems that all the memories have gone, all the beliefs have gone, the language has gone, and so on. And then you might say, oh well, in that particular case, she really is a different person. That individual is completely different. But I think the lesson from the Williams example is that isn't the case. A lot can disappear and a lot can change, but we still are very tempted to think that in Williams' example, the person who is tortured is going to be me, and that's why we found it so terrifying. And also, that's, I guess, why many of us find that kind of dementia so terrifying, given that the people that experience it are often very unhappy.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Professor. Any follow-up or questions? Any further questions? No? Okay, so a round of applause to our professor. Thank you very much, Professor Crisp. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It was really a great talk. And that's it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.